Okay, I totally didn't know football was going on, so bear with me, we'll get through it. Wanted to just thank Mintegral for having me here today. They're a great partner that we have with our operations in China, and of course Pocket Gamer as well. Just as a little introduction to me, I'm Allison, I'm from JoyPac. I've spent 8 years in the game industry at this point, building product and analytics teams. My favorite game is Animal Crossing, so shout out to my Animal Crossing friends for sure. Today I'm going to talk about hyper-casual games in China, talking about how the trend has come about. You know, hyper-casual has been talked about a lot, so I'm specifically going to zero in on China specifically and how the trend is a little bit different over there. We've launched 20 games over there at this point, so I'll end with talking about some lessons that we've learned. Yeah, hyper-casual. It's a new game. It's a new word in the gaming industry's vernacular. So it's really come to mean these really simple games. They have simple core gameplay loops, short session lengths. They have very broad appeal. And I want to emphasize that these games have been around always, from Crossy Road and these games back in 2013 all the way through, as you can see here. So it really is kind of an older style of game that's being brought about now because there's a new business model behind it. It's really a new way of doing business. For hyper-casual developers and publishers, it's about scale. So you can see here Voodoo and Ketchup last year launched almost 50 games in the App Store. So it really is about speeding up operations and narrowing in on that very fun gameplay of these games. It's a way of doing business more than anything. That said, hyper-casual is here not just because game developers and studios want to make games fast and they want to get them out the door, but the players really are there for hyper-casual as well. Players are playing hyper-casual games because it complements other gameplay that they're doing. You can see here that 78% of hyper-casual players also play in-app purchase games that have deeper and in-depth gameplay. This leaves 22% of hyper-casual players that are only playing hyper-casual games, and they're doing so for a very particular reason, and that's because they don't have very much time on their hands. That's what Michael was talking about before, that these games really engage players, and they're bringing more players into gameplay in general because they don't have a lot of time. They can pick up these games and play them while they're on the go. So now I'm going to talk about how this trend came about. I'll start with talking about what happened in the West with the App Store, and then we'll talk about how it's come about in the East. There's a great series on Pocket Gamer, actually, about hyper-casual games, and it talks about the history of the App Store and kind of where we got to this point. So I definitely recommend that you guys read that. Just to talk about, give a summary of that maybe, the App Store before hyper-casual came maybe 2 years ago kind of looked like this. It started with casual games actually that were coming out of the Facebook era. These games had great social mechanics in them and really great in-app purchase triggers. From there we went to mid-core games that had more in-depth gameplay. These guys were mastering virtual economies, and they really started to compete over those whale in-app purchase players. From there, we went to core games, which really catered their gameplay to whales, I would say, in terms of in-app purchases. And these games also had some tougher themes or more core themes in them as well. So it was from there that the hyper-casual movement happened. And in this series of articles, they talk about it being a backlash of some kind or a nostalgic revival. And I super love this term because it's very true. It is back to the basics of gameplay, really taking advantage of this new business model around ads. So that's what happened in the West, largely. It's kind of that flow. And as you kind of saw with that arrow, we are kind of getting into more, maybe a time where more engagement is needed in these games as well. Where China has come from with hyper-casual really has been from core down the line in terms of this continuum of games. So they've traditionally had these core genres ruling the charts: MMO, RPGs, strategy games, these games that I don't personally play. This is a result of predominantly PC play that was happening in China at the time. So consoles were banned in China, and everyone flocked to PC, where free-to-play mechanics really flourished. And this is where everybody was playing, really, that men and women alike. So it really brought about broad appeal for core mechanics and mid-core mechanics. Because of this, hypercasual has been a little bit slower to catch on. They've kind of been slogging down the line instead of making this revival that's happened in the West. So that said, hypercasual is definitely happening in China. That is why JoyPac exists. These are 4 games that were in the top downloaded charts in China. I think it was 3 weeks ago at this point that I pulled this. So 4 out of the top 10 downloaded games in China were hypercasual at the time. And if you looked in the West in the same time period, 10 out of 10 of the top downloaded games were hypercasual. So this is just to show that the trend has been a little bit slower to catch on, but it's definitely happening. Chinese players are very competitive. They're really socially minded. So hypercasual is really a genre that they're quite interested in. We've seen I/O games, level-based runners, physics-based puzzles, all types of hypercasual games are finding success there. It's just been a little bit slower to catch on. Another reason why it's been a slower trend, but maybe happening now, is because of the advertising ecosystem. We've seen this as well. Of course, hypercasual is all about this, the CPI, buying very low, of course, and then monetizing with ads. That's your LTV. At this point, we've seen eCPM and CPI levels really mirror that in China, particularly on iOS. That said, the advertising ecosystem over there is a little bit different, and so there are different players like Mintegral, for example, that you need to be paying attention to and engaging with. Other key challenges, like we talked about in terms of operating in China, is the government regulation and licensing. This is a table stakes issue to me. You really need to be dealing with this if you're getting into China. It's something that is always moving, but last year in particular was a special year where they stopped giving out licenses, and so at this point we've seen a maybe slow trickle of them. I think there were 1,000 out of maybe 6,000 games that were given approvals so far this year. So it's something that's evolving. For hyper-casual games that operate with advertising and operate on iOS, there's less scrutiny there, so you can still operate in that space, but the regulations around it are still being defined, so it's something we watch very closely. Yeah, the other part of operating in China, which was asked about before, is Android. So what's going on there is that the Android stores are very fragmented across large tech companies, internet service providers, and cell phone manufacturers. It's really important to be on all of them. Once you start operating on China, at least you need to be on these top 15 stores to get market coverage. You also need to be on these stores to protect your IP as well. So I don't want to scare you too much about China because it really is a huge opportunity. And when I started calculating these numbers, it actually was really eye-opening to me that there are 242 million iOS devices in China. In the United States, where I'm from, there's 250 million devices as a whole, and that's across iOS and Android. So it really is a huge market opportunity in China to be getting your games over there. China's also very appealing because of the engagement that players have with games over there. The mobile phone usage is much more integrated into people's lives in China. This is because the rise of mobile phones really came about with the rise of their economy. So they really have a mobile-first culture. This is just to say that everyone has a phone and they use it because their society requires that. So they spend a lot of time on their phone, and they actually spend a higher percentage of that time playing games in particular. So at JoyPac, we were founded about a year ago, specifically because we saw these challenges in the market for hypercasual developers, and we saw this opportunity as well. So as a hypercasual developer, you're creating your game in a couple of weeks, and so the dauntingness of China is definitely a thing, and that's why JoyPac has come about. We've really tried to blend the West and the East. The legal jurisdiction is with our entity out of Copenhagen. We try to have very transparent and open business practices and a straightforward relationship, but we also bring a very Eastern get-it-done style of teamwork. We have a 25-person team in Beijing that handles all of our operations, our live ops, and our access that you really need to have in China to get business done. So that's my sales pitch at this point. I want to talk about the games that we have. I'm a data person at my core, and so we've launched over 20 games at this point. We've actually had 20 million downloads so far this year. I need to update my slide. But this is just to say we've had great traction and some good insights that I'll share with you now. So when you're considering taking your games into China, and hypercasual in particular, I like to talk about more than blocks and balls are needed in these games to really engage Chinese players. This is in particular to user acquisition and the marketability of the game. We had this game called Fluffy Fall. We published this game with What Games out of Paris, and we were launching it right around the Lunar New Year. So what we did was change 3 of the characters in the game to reflect the Chinese characters and reflect what was going on with the New Year. This really helped with the engagement in our ads. It also helped with retention in our game, so we saw the numbers improve here. Getting back to that dominance of kind of core playing and those hardcore mechanics, the gameplay in hypercasual can be snackable, but it needs to have some personally relatable element to it as well. Another thing we've seen work really well, this is our game Skip School. You guys saw an ad for it as well. It's just a very awkward game, quite honestly. It puts this character into awkward situations. It's kind of nostalgic. I know this isn't something that you will necessarily get as a Westerner, but social and virality is something that you can support in your game, specifically by putting these shareable triggers into your game. So we look at TikTok and WeChat as the most important platforms for building in hooks for social sharing. Yeah, this one's been fun. It's one of our top games. My next point is about retention. The industry talks a lot about day one retention, and I have a little bit of a beef with it just because it's so talked about, and I think we talk about it without really understanding what it necessarily means. So day one retention, I get it. You definitely need a baseline of around 40% day one retention to be launching your games over there. This tells you if your gameplay is good in your game. So focus on that. Focus on your gameplay improvements in particular if day one isn't meeting a certain threshold. But day 7 retention and beyond is what's going to tell you if your game is going to make money. So I have to read it, but the lift you see in lifetime value, if you increase day 7 retention by 1%, so you're going from like 10% to 11% for day 7, LTV is 10 times more if you do that versus increasing your day 1 retention. So again, kind of get at your baseline of 40% of day 1, but then focus all of your efforts actually on day 7 retention and engagement metrics. With hypercasual working on such small margins, this kind of a lift is a deal breaker, really, for many games. Like I talked about, short bursts of gameplay are what attract players to hypercasual games in the first place. This is broad across all cultures. Chinese players in particular have comparatively longer session lengths. So we're talking 3 to 5 minutes instead of 1 to 2 minutes on average. This has design implications that you need to be taking into account for your gameplay and engagement, as well as your ad monetization placements as well. So just being aware of this, that it's a little bit longer in China, keeping your game fun and snackable, but also keeping it fun and snackable while being relatively longer, I should say. Localization and culturalization-wise, Stella was talking about this with the ads in particular. It's also important within the game. It's minimal for hypercasual, of course, because there's limited text, but it's still very important. This means translating your text to simplified Chinese, but not using Google Translate. You need to use a local speaker, a native speaker, to get the nuance right, even in a hypercasual game. You can also do some modifications to the content, like I was talking about with fluffy characters, colors, things like that are still important with hypercasual. The last point I want to make is about showing advertising in your game. Chinese players really have a high threshold for seeing advertising. They interact with advertising on a daily basis in their life, and as I've talked about, kind of their mobile phone, they see this all the time. So there are elegant ways to integrate ads into your games. Rewarded videos in particular are much more appealing to players and across all cultures as we've seen. But Chinese players are also very open to ads being splashed at them, interstitials, banners. So my advice to you is to build it in and to not be shy about it either. Really put the hooks there, and it's almost like a subtraction game instead of an addition game as you're putting ads in. So that's everything I wanted to say about hypercasual in China. For the most part, it's the same trend like we've seen in the West. It's come about in a different way. It's been a little bit slower, but it's definitely here. The Chinese players, like I said, are competitive and social, and they love this type of gameplay. It's a huge opportunity for Western developers as well to get over there. And I would love to, I think we're going to take questions in a panel maybe. So I don't want to take your questions.
Look at you.
Right now.
You're a professional. That's very slick.
Right?
Can I have a round of applause, please, for Allison? You might as well take a seat.